Hello, I'm Jerry Jordan. I'm the Executive Secretary at the American Board of Urology. And it's a pleasure to join you, and I thank you for joining me while I present to you the changes to what I'll call for now the ABU MOC program. I'm talking to you on behalf of the trustees, and so let me tell you a little bit about the trustees. We have 12 trustees, and they are nominated by a number of organizations, and they're listed on this slide. They serve staggered terms, and they are all in active clinical practice. They come from private practice, from academics linked to private practice, and so we're very sensitive to try and cover as many aspects of urology as we can. And we're also sensitive to the demographics of location and regional considerations, and try and spread our trustees about across the country as well. They're not compensated. They spend at least 6 weeks of their lives devoted to carrying on the business of the ABU. We're grateful to them. Without their efforts, the ABU wouldn't be able to do business, and we thank them for their expertise. Let me clarify the relationship between ABU and the AUA. We are not a committee of the AUA, and the AUA doesn't work for us. We are separate corporations. We have different targets in many ways. We both have a public trust initiative, but how we accomplish that public trust initiative is different from one organization to the other. Now, this doesn't mean that we don't interact with the AUA. We interact very closely with them and depend on them for many things, and so we're grateful for that affiliation with the AUA, but we are separate entities. Let me cover now a little bit about the history of certification and of boards. And on this slide, what you'll notice is that in 1917, the first board that eventually would come under ABMS was formed, and that was the American Board of Ophthalmology. The ophthalmologists looked to differentiate and distinguish themselves from what was then eye, ear, nose, and throat physicians, and they wanted to distinguish themselves as physicians devoted to caring for disorders of the eye. And as such, they felt that they needed to come up with a process that would certify those physicians as competent, and that process indeed was a series of tests. Otolaryngology followed a few years later. American Board of Obstetrics and Gynecology was the third board, and the fourth board was the American Board of Dermatology. You'll see a green line below the American Board of Dermatology, and that line is where the Advisory Board of Medical Specialties was formed. And that actually was the predecessor of the ABMS. It was formed by those original four specialty boards, and it was formed basically to keep those boards out of each other's way in some ways, but to also coordinate activities that were common to all. And one of those activities was to establish standards that eventually would become standards for certification. Now let's look at this. On the slide before, you notice that the American Board of Urology gave its first exams in 1935. It was actually formed in 1933. As I said, the Advisory Board of Medical Specialties was in existence at that point in time, and in fact had been renamed the American Board of Medical Specialties by the time that urology gave its first exams. There's another note on this slide, though, and that's in 1969 that the American Board of Family Medicine was incorporated. Now, why would I think that you would care about the American Board of Family Medicine? Well, there are actually two very notable things about their coming into existence as a board. The first is that it was an acknowledgement per se, de facto, that all of medicine is specialized. And so the old general practitioner, which is what many thought that the family medicine physicians were indeed a specialty of medicine. But probably more pertinent to what we're talking about was that when they were incorporated under the understanding that they would incorporate a process that would get away from lifetime certificates and they would have dated certificates. And that process was eventually to become recertification. It was exam-based, and it was based on the fact that by that time medicine was advancing both in technology and knowledge at such a pace that it was not felt that a physician who underwent a single certification process could necessarily remain competent throughout the rest of their practicing lifetime. Now, the time-limited certificates weren't revoked, and there's a lot of legal reasons why that was not accomplished. But certainly everything from that point on was aimed at recertification. If we look at our timeline further, then we look at 1985, and that's when the American Board of Urology initiated time-limited certificates. So every certificate, including specialty certificates, that were issued after 1985 were subject to recertification, and again, that was exam-based, an exam-based process. If we look along on our timeline, we see that ABMS adopted a policy called MOC, and that policy was adopted for a couple of reasons. The first is that at that point there was the thought that certification was an ongoing process, that initial certification and ultimately all of the certification actions at that point were merely an extension of the original certification, if you will, a re-upping of that certification process. But there was also another big difference about MOC, and that is that it, by the standards and by mandate, had to incorporate all aspects of the core competencies. Now, I think everybody who's listening to me is aware of the core competencies, but recall that they were first initiated for training in medical school, and then they were expanded into residency training, and then they were further expanded in residency training to be the basis of milestones. And so at that point it was decided if this was so important in the training of specialists, then it must be important for specialists to have ongoing competence in all of these competencies throughout the rest of their practicing lifetime. And so the overarching standards of MOC are based on these core competency standards, and all of the board's MOC programs in some way look at the various aspects of these core competencies. We go back to our timeline and we look at 2007, and that's when the American Board of Urology required enrollment in MOC. And again, that was for any certificate that was issued after January 1st, 2007. So that includes primary specialty certificates, that included recertification certificates, which then became MOC certificates, and it included the subspecialists who had to, in essence, agree to a process where they maintained both certificates under a common process, and that common process was MOC based. This is our current summary of MOC. It is not accurate as of the last trustees meeting, which occurred in August and has been or is in the process of being modified, and I'm going to go through those modifications with you. But you'll notice that it is based on time intervals within the 10-year cycle. So those time intervals are every 2 years. We title those as level, and that's really an administrative title that we give it in the office. And you can see that there are different projects or different assignments that need to be completed at the various levels of MOC. So this is what we have up until August, and I'll go through the modifications with you as we go on into the presentation. Now, if we go back to our timeline, and we have to go back, and I alluded to this, but we have to go back to how we got where we got. And what we have is a process which is very reliant on testing. And that makes sense, because originally it was testing that established competence, and so why wouldn't it be continued testing that would be most relevant in assuring continued competence? And so throughout this timeline, it was a modification of that testing process. So that's how MOC got to where it is. The ABU doesn't really agree with that process. And again, philosophically, what that process says is that there is initial certification, but initial certification has to be re-upped or reaffirmed at intervals in order to decide and to be able to represent to the public that a specialist is competent throughout the rest of his practicing lifetime. And so that process would say that we would have to undergo that same kind of testing up until that individual retired from practice. Well, the ABU has had problems with that concept for a number of years, and finally we've been able to establish changes which match what we believe matches our philosophy better. And we're calling that the Lifelong Learning Program. It is replacing MOC. We don't agree with the name MOC, and we don't agree with it in concept, nor do we look at it as continuing certification. So what do we really mean by Lifelong Learning Program? Well, let's go back to the timeline first, and now you'll notice that the timeline looks a little bit different than the one I've been showing you. And so what we have initially is initial certification. And indeed, we do regard that as a singular event. And that's an event that basically says to the public that all of this accredited training that our candidates go through, that it has worked, and what we have then is a process, a metric that proves that they are competent. Now, we understand that it is a single metric, but it is a metric that is relatively well established. And that metric allows us to say that the certified urologist has been proven competent based on completion of training and completion of testing. But then from that point on, urology is different, because we have a population, all of whom have been proven competent, that are now in practices that as they go along, they may evolve to be very different from the training that they originally had. And that process is the lifelong learning process, and that career pattern is one that we don't believe just continuing testing really does anything to allow us to make any further statements to the public. But what it does allow us to do is it allows us to come alongside our certified diplomates and assist them as they go through with keeping up with remaining competent, with remaining competent technologically, and remaining competent from the standpoint of medical knowledge. And that is the basis of our new concept of lifelong learning. Now, there are other changes that are required. And one is to recognize that if we're going to do that, that we need to limit the obligations of the diplomate to interface with us and complete tasks. Many diplomates have to complete a number of tasks at their home institutions. We basically acknowledge that, and I'll get to how we have accommodated for that. You'll notice that this slide tells you that instead of intervals at every 2 years, we're going to have 2 intervals throughout the entire cycle. So one at year 4 and the other at year 7 through 10. And there will be different assignments at those 2 intervals. We're in the process of working out the workflow both for the diplomate as well as for the office staff here, so that we can make this transition smoothly without overloading the diplomate at certain of the new levels and without overloading the staff. So more to follow on those changes. The next is the development of a portal in association with our internet and with our website. And that portal is essentially a page which is the diplomate's page by name and by number. That contains a dashboard, and that dashboard will allow the diplomate to look at where they are in their lifelong learning cycle, to see what they have completed, to see what they have to complete in the future, and when they have to complete it by. And the other thing is the ability to upload directly into that site much of the information that we require, and in fact that includes the practice logs. And I'm going to make another comment on the practice logs later. The other is what I referred to earlier, and that is the fact that diplomates have to complete quality improvement projects, many of them associated with either their academic faculties or their health systems. And we are now a member of Portfolio, and the Portfolio sponsors are indeed many of those health systems, many of those academic institutions, and in fact many medical societies. And what that program does is it vets various practice improvement or quality improvement projects, presents them to the boards as possibly pertinent for the quality improvement programs that the boards require. And as I said, we are members of Portfolio, and we actively have solicited and encouraged many of the societies that we interact with to perhaps become Portfolio sponsors. So let's go back to the chart here and look down at the very bottom corner, and that's where we have the log and we have the exam. Now, we have heard in spades that our trustees don't like necessarily the log. So why do we continue to have it? Well, we have it because the data that we obtain, the information that we obtain about urologists and about urology cannot be replaced by another process, or at least not at this point. The log allows us to know what our new candidates do as they go into practice. What are they doing immediately after they complete training? It has told us how laparoscopy and robotics have been incorporated into the specialty. At one point, we considered going to two-tier training and two-tiered certification, and our log showed us that that was exactly the wrong thing to do. And it allows us to see how our mature diplomates, how they have evolved their practices to, if you will, informally subspecialize in many ways. And thus it allows us to better meet their needs as well. So the data is invaluable, and the data is necessary for us to be able to do our job and to know everything that we need to know about our diplomates. Now, the exam has been changed, and we've gone back to a modular exam. The exam has two modules. One, a module that everybody will take, and it's called the Urology Core Module. That is basics of practice. It's those basics that one needs when they have an office practice or if they have an ER obligation or an ER coverage obligation. And those basics are what will be tested. One question I've been asked is there pediatrics on it? Yes, there will be some pediatrics because there is some basic pediatrics that one who is in the office or in the emergency room might be confronted with. I can't tell you that it's much, and I can't tell you that it will be on every exam, but there will be some on there. But the esoterics and the minutia of the higher level pediatric urology is not part of that core. And then there are the content-specific modules, and I'll summarize them for you. One is essentially oncology, one is calculus disease, robotics, laparoscopy, One of them is andrology, including infertility, and one of them has to do with reconstructive surgery, both incontinence, voiding dysfunction, those kind of issues. One question that we've been asked is, why is there not a general urology module? Well, when we develop these modules, we develop them with the idea of being able to provide feedback to our diplomates. And we ran into problems with developing enough questions to be able to give good feedback. We are open to developing that module and are in the process right now of trying to do that. So we have heard your suggestions, and we hope to have that, but it will not be on the 2017 test. Let's talk about scoring. The exam is scored on a criterion-based basis. That means that it does generate a pass-fail line. But what also happens is it generates regions of marginal performance. So marginal pass, marginal fail, all the way down to the bottom. Well, what we are using are those regions to establish who needs some help perhaps in further CME in order to gain medical knowledge in those areas which they haven't performed as well as they want to perform and haven't performed as well as we would like for them to perform in those areas. This is the first year that we have provided this kind of feedback, and those individuals will be provided conditional passes, the condition removed after they complete the CME, and we will help direct them to that. So that's a big change with regards to our exam. Let me, on this slide, let you just read that and see what resources are available on our ABU site. And what I'm going to do now is to go back and address some questions and to make some further comments, particularly about the exam. I think it's obvious. One question is there a requirement to take the exam? Yes. If you don't take the exam, then that's tantamount to failing the exam. Is this the first year that we provided feedback? I've answered that question. And is this the first year for CME? Yes, indeed, it is. Is the exam different in structure? Yes, it's modular now as opposed to the old 100-question exam, which covered a broad basis of urology. First year for conditional passes? Yes. What years are lifelong learning going to occur? I'm not exactly sure what that question is asking, but I think that I have summarized it by describing the levels where things will be assigned that are part of that process. And as of now, going forward, our process is the lifelong learning program. We've talked about the general urology module. Does lifelong learning apply to the subspecialties? It does not, at least not in the form that I have described it to you. By agreement with the advisory committees for the subspecialties, the lifelong learning process that the subspecialties will undergo will be different in form than that I have described to you. This question, I'm not absolutely sure what is being asked. It says if your practice does 3 out of 4 areas of a given module and you're weak in the 4th, then being assigned CMEs in the 4th area appears to be a disconnect. I think you have to understand that we can't make a program that fits everybody absolutely. But what I would say is if you pick a module and 3 out of the 4 things that are asked in that module and you only have 35 questions in that module, you probably have a good chance of knowing the bulk of that module, and it's as good as we can do at this point in time. Does this replace MOC? Yes, indeed, it is the new MOC, if you will, for us, but it's very different in both concept as well as name. How will the board contact diplomates to let them know when they will start lifelong learning process? Well, as we get our portal online, and it's now soft released to the staff and to the trustees. As it comes online, that dashboard will make the lifelong learning process plain to everybody individual. Is participation required in the lifelong learning process if retired, thinking of retiring, or clinically inactive? Yes and no. What we have done is made application to ABMS for a designation that we're calling Emeritus Diplomate. Now, the Emeritus Diplomate is a program that's designed for those that have completed 3 recertification cycles, or 3 MOC cycles, if you will. And it's designed to allow individuals to remain in the lifelong learning process, but a process that is relevant to them at that phase of their career, and it allows them to have that certificate for as long as they meet the criteria, which will be significantly altered from those that are required from those that are in active practice. Is the exam no longer pass-fail? I think really what the question is if I fail the exam, are you going to take my certificate away? So let's deal with that. The answer is the ABU has no desire to fail you on an exam and have that as the only metric that governs a decision with regards to your certificate. We know way more about you than just your performance on an exam. And it is because we have that information from the logs, from mandated peer review, from mandated narratives with regards to complications, from mandated narratives with regards to Clavian 5 complications, and from completion of the safety modules, all of which have completion criteria and questions. We have a lot more information about you than just a single metric, that being the exam. So we don't really have any desire to use that in a pass-fail fashion, or at least as a singular metric. But let's be honest about the whole thing. What this is a change in philosophy on the part of the Board of Urology, and it is based on our opinion of our diplomates, and that is that urologists are professionals. Well, keep in mind that what professionalism means is that the professional oftentimes is willing to sacrifice personally in order to assure the better for the person trusted to him, in this case the public or the patient. And so professionalism would say that urologists will want to keep their medical knowledge up to speed. And we full well believe that that's the case. Why then do we give feedback? Well, the education literature shows that people are not aware of what areas they're really good at, nor are they necessarily aware of what areas they're not so good at. And so giving feedback helps to inform our diplomates with regards to those areas. In other words, to come alongside them and help them determine which CME is the CME that will benefit them most. Now, we're banking on the fact that our diplomates are not going to respond by blowing off the exam and then just coming in and say, well, I'll get CME assigned. We're banking on the fact that they are professionals, and in many ways what we've done is put the ball in the diplomate's court. But keep in mind, we have to defend this process, and it's the fact that we hope that that's what's going to occur is what's going to allow us to defend this process. What happens if you miss a level? We'll do everything possible to work with the diplomate to get them back on speed. If you think you're going to miss a level, please just let us know. How do we know when to do the new process? Again, the portal will take care of that with its dashboard. And one question, do I get credit for what I've already done at my levels of MOC? And the answer is yes, absolutely, you will get credit for what you've already done. So let me close by saying that we're very grateful to our diplomates. We depend on our diplomates. We depend on their support, and the public depends on our interfacing with them via our diplomates. Medicine is constantly changing and is constantly having to look at itself and is constantly undergoing a process of quality improvement. That means that the diplomate has to be constantly going through a process of quality improvement. And what that also means is that the Board of Urology has to be constantly looking at its processes and going through the process of quality improvement so that we maintain relevance for our diplomates. What that says is we are dependent on your feedback. And the changes that I have described to you, every one of those has been changes that have been suggested by diplomates who have been willing to call us and to give us positive feedback. Now that feedback can be done with a telephone call to me. We also have an email address, info@abu.org, where you can email us and give us your input. So again, thank you for allowing me to join you this morning.